WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Nick Austin. A little bit later in the show, we'll take a look at how we balance the tension between free speech and the need for us to be able to protect elected officials.
But first on the Metro, young people are struggling with their mental health. We know this because depression, self-harm, and suicide are all up over the past few decades among adolescents. Now, many government institutions are responding to this issue. Locally, the Detroit-Wayne Integrated Health Network is taking charge. Last month, they rolled out their second phase of their mobile crisis units by expanding services to children. They also created their own mental health youth council for young people to help come up with solutions to the mental health issues their peers are facing. So, what does the Detroit-Wayne Integrated Health Network think needs to be done to address the mental health struggles of adolescents and teens, and why do they think the need is so high right now? To discuss this, we have Eric Doeh here. He is the president and chief executive officer of the Detroit-Wayne Integrated Health Network. President Doeh, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, Tia. Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much for having me here.
Of course. So, why is DWE expanding its services to provide more care in response to teens and kids?
Look, I tell you, when it comes to children, our belief is just simple: putting children first. And for me, coming out of COVID really changed everything. I have an 8-year-old now, and she was 5 at the time. Oh. And just knowing all of the experiences that she went through, I mean, can you believe when we were in kindergarten how different it was for kids now? And so all of those things, truly kids still being able to progress and do as well as they did for those 3.5 years, or seemingly 3.5 years now. We at Detroit-Wayne, it just became very apparent to us that we had to do something. And these conversations years ago that some of us, thought were so secretive to have, kids are now having these conversations out in the open. Seeing your therapist isn't something that that has this stigma or around it. Folks actually want to engage in seeking help.
Which I love those touch points there. I am an auntie of seven. I have 7 nieces and nephews, and oftentimes I hear about the struggles. I see the things that they're facing and they're going through. Like you said, it's not compared to anything we went through in kindergarten, even through grade school, middle school, high school. And so you have an 8-year-old. I have a nephew around that same age, and I watched him struggle trying to do online school at 5 years old. I mean, it's impossible to try to collect that attention at that age. Mm-hmm. So what were some of the things that you all were putting into place in your mind secretly when you were having those conversations?
Sure. I mean, look, just recognizing whether you were talking about depression, you're talking about bullying in school, because those are things that kids having to deal with now, anxiety, all of those types of, challenges. So at Detroit-Wayne, we work very closely with our children's providers. We have about 15 plus children's providers. And so, whether it involved, taking homework and actually delivering it to homes, as we did in Hinkster and in other communities, having tablets and iPads and stuff that we worked with our providers to actually, have delivered to our members, our kids. Those were so important to us, but we took it a step further. We decided as a signature program, we would make it simple, putting children first. And what that meant was in everything that we did, every endeavor, our goal was to make sure that kids were put first. So whether it meant expanding resources, providing, additional dollars for our provider network, working with other partners within our community, and working closely with our parents too, creating youth councils within Detroit-Wayne was also important. It just became not just a mantra, but something that our board encouraged us to push forward with. And we saw great results, because of that. I mean, Wayne County has well over 285,000 school kids. By no means am I saying that all 285,000 of those kids, need behavioral health services. But wouldn't it be great that if those unfortunate times ever came about, that parents didn't have to look around to figure out where to turn to, and the services are free. It is not a commercial. It is truly free.
Right now, we are speaking with Eric Doeh, the president and Chief Executive Officer of the Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network. And we talked a little bit earlier there about, of course, kids and they're actually now teens especially are seeking out professionals and seeking out help. I know once again in my family, just with experience, I've seen it happen. And hey, I need a little bit of extra attention. Hey, I need to talk about this with someone else. And a lot of the times the parents are okay with it. You're starting to see a lot of that. So, as we expand on that and talk a little bit more about kids reaching out, talk about the Youth Council.
Youth Council, look, I am an old man now, and the more gray hair I develop, I realize that my 8-year-old knows a whole lot about stuff, and she clearly believes this. So that's a whole nother story there, But the Youth Council was truly designed to bring about the ideas of young people when it comes to behavioral health, mental health. What are they thinking? What are their thoughts? What's going on in their heads? What are those conversations that they're having amongst themselves that they're not having with adults? I mean, why is it challenging sometimes for us to have those conversations, with our kids? We can talk about homework with our kids, but why is it that we can't talk about, mental health challenges? When it comes to physical health, you're trying to figure out, hey, we have a dental appointment this week. Why can't we talk about what's going on in your head? How are you feeling? Reach Us Detroit was a program that we came up with to encourage kids to text. Look, nowadays it's not about picking up the phone and talking. It's about, getting on your phone, using those fingers and texting. So that created a resource there where kids could actually text, their concerns and actually receive services right within that engagement there. And, 15 years, younger, older, those services are being offered here at Detroit Wayne as well.
So when I think about the Youth Council, it's new, of course, it's something new that you all are going to try to reach young people, but also allow young people to talk to one another and converse with one another in an interpersonal space. So, what are you hoping that it accomplishes, number one? But the application process is closed. Have you already chosen the council?
Look, we are still working on that, and I will expand it if need to. I will open it up if we need to, because the goal here is really to bring young people together. It's not about creating something where there's a challenge or difficulty in trying to get in. The goal, truly, what a great question, though, is first to start off by having those discussions so that this is no longer a stigma. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's a challenge, but I'll tell you this much. When it comes to physical health, why is it that it's so easy for us to have these conversations, whether you're talking about hypertension and everything else that surrounds it. But when it comes to mental health, all of a sudden there's this stigma and there's this challenge, especially, look, within the African American community, sometimes Uncle Bob or, who've always had these challenges, we've just seen it at, that's just Uncle Bob or James or just being the way he is, right? Not realizing that those are true challenges. And so what happens is that it becomes exacerbated. And oftentimes when it reaches that critical point is when folks are trying to figure out where to turn. And we don't want this to be the case for our young people.
Especially not now in today's society with everything we have going on. Like you said, your daughter, she'll look at something on the internet and she'll believe it. And that's just the way we are. We'll actually get into just a little bit more of conversations like that later in the show. But just talking about like just dispelling disinformation and all the things that are going through the kids' heads right now with the phones and social media, TikTok, and everything else that's happening right now. There are so many ways that a youth council could help intervene and help just kind of give them a space to talk without the echo chambers of other things that are happening. So I think about the trained professionals that you all have working with the kids and the young people. What are they seeing right now with the young kids?
Sure. I mean, what folks are seeing right now is that when it comes to depression, anxiety, look, so much is going on in and around schools, and it's no longer just about what happens at that particular or in that particular environment. Social media plays such an important, role now. I mean, look, when your kid is holding that phone in his or her hands, the amount of information that pours into them within a second, let alone if they're on that device for more than an hour. And so what our clinicians are now discovering is that, that heightened anxiety, depression, kids no longer feeling that they are connected. And I often say this to parents when we have these conversations: listen to your kids. Actually have a conversation. And when you ask your kid, look, my kid gets in the car every day when I pick her up from school, right? First thing I ask her is, how was your day? And believe me, sometimes I get those one-word answers, fine. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I might get lucky and get a sentence, right? But the idea is not to necessarily, push it, but is to simply ask, how was your day? Because it invites a bit of dialogue. And from that comes the next set of questions as to, hey, did you have a good day? Did something happen? Is there something that I can do? Do you want to talk about it? And, sometimes you have to figure out the right moment, too. It may not be right there within that car ride. It might be when you get home, or just sometimes just doing things with your kids. Like we have this thing called let's make today a yes day. That means that anything you want to do, we're going to say yes. Right now, they do have some limits because she did want a dog, and I was like, look, you and I are hardly home, so we can't do that one.
No.
Okay?
Can't take the dog everywhere we go.
Exactly.
I love this so much. So my last question is, what kinds of training do DWIN specialists have specifically to help kids and teens? And as we go forward, what do you hope to see coming out of a youth council, or just all the things that DWIN has to offer for teens and kids, especially pertaining to mental health?
Look, you're talking about fully licensed professionals here, folks who have been through it, folks who have gotten all of the necessary trainings from the state level and have, and have done so continuously. Look, we even took it a step further, even on our law enforcement side, by, having, clinicians who are now in dispatch centers in our local police departments. But for children, though, what our goal here, honestly, when you talk about youth council and all of these things, Youth United, another advocacy group that we have in Detroit, Wayne, the whole goal here is to first start the conversation. You got to start the conversation first, because conversation invites dialogue. Dialogue invites an opportunity to really listen. And in listening is when you gain that insight to then know what to do, because we often think we have the best and greatest answers. But listening to your kids, I bet you're going to be surprised as to the information that they have and they're willing to share with you.
Eric Doeh is the president and chief executive officer of the Detroit Wayne Integrated Health Network. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro this morning.
Thank you so much for having me here. And Nick, thank you so much for having me as well.
This is the Metro on 1019 WDET, and coming up, we'll hear from a Michigan congressman about why he and his peers are concerned about China.
This is the Metro, right here on 1019 WDET FM. I am Tia Graham.
And I'm Nick Austin. And Tia, one of the few issues Congress can agree on is standing against China. A Michigan congressman has been a key role in that effort, and West Michigan Republican John Molinar recently became a chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. Molinar tells WDET's Quinn Kleinfelter the committee has a broad agenda, from helping U.S. automakers remain competitive to canceling China's control over the popular social media platform TikTok.
You look at how the CCP uses TikTok, there is the ability to access Americans' private data and to influence Americans based on the algorithms they use. And so what we've proposed is not a ban on TikTok, but forcing TikTok to choose. Do they want to serve the Chinese Communist Party, or do they want to serve the American people? And to give them time, their parent company ByteDance, which is headquartered in China, to sell TikTok to an American company or some kind of a company that is not an adversary of the United States.
Beyond TikTok itself, what do you see the U.S. can do to combat this overall cyber espionage?
Well, we need to be vigilant in the government as well as in the private sector, in our strategic utilities, different sources of water, electricity, our energy, the grid. All these areas, we need to up our game in terms of cybersecurity. The FBI has been very involved in this. We experienced hacking at the highest levels of the federal government, the Commerce Department. We've seen them fly a spy balloon over our country. They've bribed military officials. So a lot of nefarious activity that we need to continue to expose and then respond so that we don't let them influence the United States of America.
One of the responses that you've done in a different sector regarding China was you sponsored the No Goshen Act, the bill that would deny certain green energy tax benefits to companies that were connected to China and countries of concern. Now, for people that aren't aware, Goshen is one of China's largest electric vehicle battery makers, and the Michigan legislature approved it to build about a $2.5 billion plant in Green Charter Township. When you're sponsoring the No Goshen bill, is it because of national security concerns or because of the competition that China would pose to U.S. automakers or for some other reason?
Well, I think it's multiple reasons. Number one, we should not be subsidizing our adversaries to compete against us. So in the case of Goshen, they're already subsidized by China by putting subsidies from state of Michigan taxpayer dollars. We're also giving them a tremendous advantage. And then finally, they're trying to access federal taxpayer dollars as well. And so when you consider that American taxpayer dollars would be used to fund companies that are affiliated with our adversaries, to me, that's a huge strategic mistake. We are also noting that they are within 100 miles of Camp Grayling. And, when you consider the spy balloon that went over the United States, of course, China disavowed any knowledge or that it was not a serious concern. We just can't trust what the Chinese Communist Party says. And so I've heard from two former CIA directors, we heard that in committee, that China will leverage anything having to do with Goshen and manufacturing to benefit and even perhaps sells. This is a concern when you hear that from Mike Pompeo, who's a Republican, as well as Leon Panetta, who's a Democrat, talking about the nefarious activity of the CCP, and we simply don't need that in Michigan.
When you talk about bipartisanship, I know you were with a bipartisan group of lawmakers, I think last year, that talked to Ford and General Motors and some other auto suppliers, not just about Goshen, but about the reliance on Chinese supply chains in particular, especially for the auto industry here in Michigan, and what Congress might be able to do to help. Have you gotten any ideas what Congress could do to try to help lessen the reliance on Chinese supply chains?
Well, I think it's important to note that what is driving a lot of us competing on China's home field is this push for electric vehicles. Federal mandates, the emission standards that the EPA is putting out that forces people to buy electric vehicles. And what that does is forces our auto companies to rely on Chinese technology and materials where China has a strategic advantage. I would much rather see customers choose which vehicle they want to drive and allow our American auto companies to innovate and respond to customer demand as well as new technologies rather than being forced into this by a government mandate that actually benefits China, who is the largest exporter of automobiles and has a strategic advantage in many of these areas.
That was Republican John Molinar speaking with WDET's Quinn Kleinfelter.
This is The Metro on 1019 WDET FM. That was Nick Austin. I'm Tia Graham. The Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, released its annual civil rights report today. The organization says last year it received the highest number of anti-Muslim bias complaints on record. NPR's Jason DeRose spoke with Corey Saylor, CAIR's Director of Research and Advocacy, to learn more.
The Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, took in more than 8,000 bias reports in 2023, and it says nearly half of them came in the final 3 months of the year, following the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel.
I was stunned by the sheer volume of complaints we got.
Corey Saylor directs research and advocacy at CAIR.
In 2022, our numbers showed the first ever drop since we started tracking incidents, and then to see all of that erased, it's a real insight into how easy it is for someone to just flip the Islamophobia switch back to on.
CARE says 15% of reports were about employment bias, more than 8% involved schools, including colleges and universities, and Saylor says more than 7% of reports involved allegations of hate crimes, including the case of the young boy allegedly killed by his family's landlord near Chicago.
I just don't know how much hate it takes to drive an adult to target a child. And I think it's also fair to say that hate did not originate last October.
CARE's report also includes mention of some bright spots. In 2023, New York City and Minneapolis permitted the call to prayer to be broadcast over loudspeakers. New Jersey and Georgia began recognizing Muslim Heritage Month, and school districts in at least 6 states added at least one Muslim holiday to academic calendars.
That was NPR's Jason DeRose speaking with Corey Saylor of the Council on American Islamic Relations. This is The Metro. Now, are you an avid reader? People like our producer, Sam Corey, well, he has a huge appetite for books. Every time I'm in the station or walking past the studio, he's head down in a book. And just like Sam, recycling sustainability is something that's important to him as well. Well, you're in luck, Sam, and people like Sam. Bookstock is a used book and media sale, and it is a community service project. Donations make the event possible, with the entire process of collecting and sorting gently used books and media. Organizing and staffing the sale is 100% volunteer-driven. This April 7th through April 14th, Bookstock is happening at Laurel Park Place. Joining us on the Metro is an honorary chairperson of Bookstock and columnist for the Detroit Free Press. We have Neal Rubin. Neal, as always, thank you for coming to the station, but thank you for joining the Metro for the first time.
It's exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. So, we're celebrating new shows, new programmings. You all are going to be celebrating 20 years of Bookstock, which is a huge deal. Talk about that.
It's kind of amazing. 20 years of people mobbing Laurel Park Place, like you said, in Livonia for Bookstock. And it just shows, we wondered, 10 years ago, are we like selling wagon wheels? Are we obsolete here with so many people reading on their phones, reading online? No, people are still swarming. We sell more and more books year after year, and at this point, we've distributed more than $3 million for literacy and education projects over the 20 years. And a lot of that is $1 at a time for a paperback book. It's just heartening to know that people still love to read.
I know, and like you said, thinking about the way technology kind of ushered in new ways and new forms of reading and just new forms of it, and you see it going up. What have you seen within this last decade or so in terms of book sales and people just coming in to have physical media in their hands?
I think it's that touch of a book. And, I would love to tell you that I made up this line for you. In fact, I've said it before. But what we do, it's the ultimate recycling, which you mentioned. We get books out of people's basements and up in other people's laps where books belong.
Yes, I love that. You have been working on that one. I love that one, Neal. So, once again, it's 20 years of Bookstock. You talked about that. There are discounts and extra cool things that are going along. I saw you have so many just cool days, like discounts for teachers and all types of fun things. So go ahead and get into those things.
Sure. And the stuff I don't cover, it's bookstockmi.org to catch up with it. But I think sometimes we add this stuff just to amuse ourselves. But for instance, this year for the 20th anniversary, if you bring in one of our nylon book bags from a previous year, Monday through Friday, it's 20% off. Whatever you fill it with, 20% off, and have a great day. Teacher Appreciation Days, you can imagine, we adore teachers. So Tuesday and Wednesday from 2 to 7 p.m., come in with an ID that says you're a teacher. Everything's 50% off. And we get teachers stocking their classrooms with this, or other people just stocking their bookshelves at home. And hey, teachers deserve off time. We're totally fine with that.
Do what you want with your free time, but have a book with you when you're doing it.
Always. Do you carry a book in your car?
I do not, but Sam Corey, like I was saying, has a book everywhere he goes, and I always see his head in a book, no matter if it's sent to the station, we brought it with him, he's reading, and I love that.
If you need an extra book, you can just probably go to Sam. He's got one lying around.
He does, and it's contagious to see him reading. It makes me want to pick up a book, which it usually does, and just find something to look into. But what is it like if you could just let people know who've never been to Bookstop, just walking into Laurel Park Place and just kind of getting that vibe, that sense of being around the books and the media?
Yeah, there are sort of stations throughout the mall. There might be fiction over here, recorded things, vinyl, nice. CDs, DVDs, audiobooks are in another section. And it goes end to end. And, I always want to remind people, we sort this. It's thousands of volunteer hours. It's not just some big pile of books in the middle of the mall. 50 or 60 different categories plus all the musical stuff. So you can kind of, and we'll give you a map and you can find what you're interested in, mysteries, biographies, history, whatever it is. We've pretty well got you covered. And something else we always stress is, we have upwards of 400,000 items, which we can't display all at once because the mall would like to continue in business as a mall. Exactly. Thank you very much. So we trot out new stuff every day.
Yeah.
Bringing it in from the warehouse, bringing it up from beneath the table where you're looking at stuff on top. So it's kind of constant discovery, which is part of the fun for me. I'll go back 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. And, just thinking about literacy just a little bit and just thinking about the importance of reading. When we have Bookstock, is 20 years old now. That means 20 years of people loving to read and spreading the joy and love of reading. So just talk a little bit about Bookstock's goals of pushing literacy.
Well, again, it's sort of more recycling. We help nonprofits teach people to read or improve their reading, and hey, then they can come to Bookstock and buy books. But I was thinking of some of the organizations we partner with. Oakland Literacy Council for a long time, and they do terrific work with actual reading instruction. Remain in touch. This is one of my favorites because, let's face it, as a society, we tend to lock people up and forget about them. Remain in touch helps inmates in prisons, typically northern Michigan, record books, read children's books, and record them for their own kids.
Yeah.
So it's a way of staying in touch from afar. Progressionista, it's a book club for 8 to 12-year-old girls when they're, and frequently with a professional there to talk about their own experiences. So it connects books with other important things and just kind of reminds kids that, hey, this isn't just something you have to do in school. This can be fun. This can be lifelong.
Well, Neal, I want to say, number one, thank you so much for being here to spread the joy of Bookstock with us, running up against time here. Neal Rubin, you're an honorary chairperson of Bookstock and columnist for the Detroit Free Press. Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro. Bookstock this year is April 7th through April 4th. It's happening at Laurel Park Place. What are the times?
11 to 6 on Sundays, 11 to 7 other days, and I look forward to being back here for your 20th anniversary.
Wouldn't that be a trip? Oh, Neal, wouldn't that be a trip? Neal Rubin, thank you so much for being here, and good luck with Bookstock.
Thank you.
This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and coming up, we'll hear about a case filed against a man who allegedly threatened an election official. What does it mean? Does it portend anything for the fall? And how do we balance and protect the work of our election officials while still allowing for free speech? You won't want to miss it when we continue on the Metro.
This is The Metro on 1019 WDET-FM. I am Tia Graham.
And I'm Nick Austin. And you know, Tia, right now, I know even talking with folks around here, a lot of people are concerned about the sanctity of our election process, including in what we've seen in recent years, really being tested nationally with things like the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol, as well as right here in Detroit. You remember 2020, when supporters for former President Donald Trump attempted to stop the vote count from even occurring while it was still in its process. So when we hear discourse like these, it can become increasingly thin, increasingly difficult to find where the line is between discontent and inciting violence. Like I said, it's getting a little thin. And as we look to our next election, we got another case that kind of brings these issues into focus. A local man was charged by prosecutor Karen McDonald in Oakland County for allegedly making a threatening statement against an election official, an act deemed as a true threat by officials, but the accused claims it falls under protected speech. So it brings up this tension between ensuring safety for elections and protecting free speech. In fact, a little later, we'll delve into those issues with Professor Nadine Strassen, who's a former ACLU president and expert in these kind of cases. But first, to get a clearer picture of what happened out in Oakland County, including this incident, what led to the charges, and how it fits into our local elections, we're joined by Craig Mauger. He is a state government and politics reporter for the Detroit News. Craig, welcome to the Metro.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on this Tuesday.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. I know you've been reporting on this for a bit, so I'm just going to let us know the importance events of this. So let's start out with the people at the center of the incident. And can you tell us a little bit about what led up to the incident that occurred in December at the recount election?
Yeah, so, if you want to talk about what started all of this and how we got to this point, you kind of have to go all the way back to the 2020 presidential election, where we had a very contested election in Michigan between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump and his supporters in this state maintained without evidence. I mean, they never had proof of this, and they never put forth evidence that would have backed up these claims that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen from him due to Biden's victory. That set off a whole lot of interest and scrutiny about how our voting system works in the state of Michigan. And that has continued up until 2024, where we're likely going to have this rematch between Biden and Trump. What happened in December in Oakland County is that there was a recount of a very innocuous, kind of small, in terms of its impact, ballot measure related to one city regarding ranked choice voting. There was a push to have that race recounted. There's been lots of recounts of late in Michigan, all types of elections, to try to get from people who are questioning how the elections work. They're trying to get information on how votes are counted and what happens with these votes and if there are problems with how that is happening. So there was this recount and things got tense. And there was a man at this recount named Andrew Hess, the person who was charged yesterday. He's from Livonia. He made statements allegedly at this recount where he said that the Oakland County Director of Elections, who is Joe Rozelle, a very well-respected, well-known election official in Michigan, he made statements about Mr. Rozelle and Mr. Rozelle being hanged for treason. There are different accounts about what exactly Andrew Hess said. The prosecutor's office said in their statement yesterday that Andrew Hess said at one point during this recount, hang Joe for treason. There are other accounts from people who were there that Mr. Hess had made comments that the penalty for treason is hanging. And I think there were multiple comments made at multiple points during this by Mr. Hess, who was one of the people there trying to scrutinize this recount. So those are the details of what occurred here.
And we're going to need to find out more, and I'm sure we will as the charges press on. I know you spoke with Mr. Hess, but before we get into what he told you about this incident, I want to start with the county prosecutor, Karen McDonald, who decided to charge Hess with a felony in this case. Is there anything unique about the charge, and do we know why she decided to file these charges?
She said she made a brief remark in the press release that they put out yesterday. saying, that the people who are administrating our elections have to be protected, and any threatening remarks or comments toward them have to be taken seriously, and essentially prosecutors need to act on them. So why is this unique? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because of this increased scrutiny that has been going on election officials across the state. There have been multiple documented counts of threats against, different election officials, a canvasser in Wayne County who was a Republican, a clerk in Oakland County who was also a Republican. There have been Democratic office holders threatened in what has occurred since November 2020. So this is a real crossroads that prosecutors, law enforcement across the state of Michigan are going to find themselves at, where they have to determine how to protect these individuals while also, understanding that there is this freedom of speech, and they have to answer the question for themselves individually as to where to draw the line.
Yeah.
Andrew Hess's attorney, as you noted in the lead-in, has argued that statements he made were protected by the First Amendment, and that Prosecutor McDonald is infringing on Mr. Hess's freedom of speech rights by bringing this charge. The Oakland County Clerk, Lisa Brown, and others have made the point that, hey, freedom of speech is not all encompassing. You don't get to say anything you want. You can't make a threatening statement related to hanging an election official who's just there to do his job.
Yeah, and that's where the line is going to be, and we're going to tease that out a little bit later when we're joined by Nadine Strawson. Looking forward to that. But before we pivot into that, while I have you, Craig, you had a chance to speak with the man at the center of this, the defendant, Mr. Hess. What did he tell you specifically in his own words when you spoke to him?
It was really, it was one of those moments in your career that you're going to remember forever. He was not shying away any sort of sense of that from what he did on December 15th. I put out a story in the Detroit News on January 9th stating that Mr. Hess was saying that a man was under investigation for a threat against Joe Rozelle. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, one of Mr. Hess's associates had reached out to me and identified that person as Andrew Hess and said that Mr. Hess would talk to me about it. And within moments of that, on January 10th, after the story ran, I had Mr. Hess on the phone, and he gave a pretty lengthy interview about why he was there and what he had to say. And he said, I said, did you say Joe Rozelle should be hanged for treason? And he said, I don't know exactly if that's what I said, but I said something likely to that effect. And I said, is that normal? And he said, yeah, I regularly tell people that the penalty for treason is death by hanging. And it's just kind of a remarkable moment that this is something that people feel comfortable talking about. It's new to me from past coverage. I'm sorry.
Yeah, right.
Sorry for the natural sound in the background here. I'm standing outside where Donald Trump's about to speak and wrap in a couple hours right now for your listeners.
Yeah.
But, it's this moment that we've arrived at. And, I questioned as someone that covers this, if everyone involved, law enforcement, prosecutors, are ready for what could occur here in the next couple of months. With this election. How do they handle these situations? How do they respond to them? They have to struggle with that, and it's going to be fascinating to watch.
Yeah. Well, Craig, I know that you got work to do there covering former President Trump's speech, so we're going to let you get back to that. But we're going to continue to monitor this as it is a very fascinating story, including with our next guest. But before we get to that, Craig Mauger, reporter with the Detroit News, thanks so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much. Bye.
This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. Coming up, we'll discuss what free speech is and where its limits are. Welcome back to the Metro, right here on 1019 WDET-FM. You're about to hear from Nick Austin. Really interesting conversation coming up. But first, I'm Tia Graham. Former President Donald Trump is visiting Grand Rapids and Green Bay, Wisconsin today. Michigan and Wisconsin are key battleground states in the 2024 election. Trump is expected to talk about President Joe Biden's handling of the U.S.-Mexico border, and polls suggest Trump has an advantage over Biden when it comes to immigration issues. Some voters are concerned about increasing illegal border crossings.
And right now, here in our current political climate, as we mentioned, Tia, the line between expressing dissatisfaction and crossing into violence seems to be getting more blurred. In fact, this blurring has had tangible effects. For example, in 2022, the U.S. grappled with a significant shortage of poll workers, and a study from the Brennan Center for Justice highlighted a trend that 1 in 6 election officials have experienced threats firsthand, and half of these have been face-to-face. So, how should we look at balancing tensions between free speech and threatening speech that can have outcomes like this? To explore this more, we're joined by Nadine Strawson, former president of the American Civil Liberties Union and a New York Law School emeritus professor and author of Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Nadine, welcome to the Metro.
I'm so delighted to be back, Nick. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back. First person I thought of when having this conversation, because I want to get into the moral and ethical framework here. So before we get into the legal question, which is also very interesting, what are we trying to balance when we think about questions of free speech versus true threats from a moral sense? I mean, how do you believe we should balance the freedom of speech to speak our minds versus the need not to cause harm to others?
If you don't mind, Nick, I'm first going to tell you what the legal distinction is, and then I'm going to comment on the moral dimension so we can compare it. The legal distinction is signaled by the fact that the Supreme Court uses the term true threat to describe a threatening statement that may constitutionally be punished. And it uses that adjective true to distinguish that legal concept from the looser, more flexible way we use the term threat in everyday speech. So I heard your prior interviewee, Craig, you said, well, this language was a threat. And I would say in everyday speech, it certainly is. But the legal concept of a constitutionally unprotected true threat is when the speaker directly targets a particular individual or small group of individuals and means to instill in that individual a reasonable, that is, objective fear that they will actually be subject to violence by the speaker. Interestingly enough, and I think importantly, the speaker does not have to intend to actually carry out the violent act. The speaker simply has to intend to instill a reasonable fear. Because if you reasonably fear that you're going to be subject to attack, it already inhibits your freedom of movement, in this case, your freedom to exercise the option of being an election worker. So that's the legal distinction, and how you enforce that standard, which is very fact-specific, obviously will depend on the particular evidence in a specific situation. But I thank you very much, Nick, for raising the moral and ethical concern, because my view as a strong free speech advocate always has been the fact that you have a legal right to say something does not mean that it is right to do so. And all of us who are responsible members of our society and are cognizant of the great harm that can be done even by speech that is and should be constitutionally protected. So we wouldn't want the government necessarily to punish that speech, but that we should still exercise self-restraint and not engage in that speech. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, because every member of the press, including yourself, is constantly engaging in what I would call editing, right? Some
Yeah.
people would say self-censorship. There are all kinds of things that you could legally say that you choose not to because it's not an effective form of communication.
Yeah.
It's not a respectful form of communication.
Yeah, Nadine,
And
if I could just jump in, though, because one of the
please.
distinctions that you made was really interesting because you talk about it's not necessarily the intent to actually harm from the speaker, but whether they intend a threat. But then this kind of brings up the scenario of what you might call a glass defendant, or maybe somebody who we might think has unreasonable expectations or thoughts about what's a harmful talk or speech. So I think this is something, it gets fact intensive, case by case. But how do we balance this? Go ahead.
Except the Supreme Court has said from the perspective of the targeted person who is allegedly subject to a true threat, that is an objective standard. It's not whether a particular person felt frightened in actuality, but whether a reasonable person, that's a concept that we use in law all the time, that it's an objective test. And let me give you a couple factual scenarios from past Supreme Court cases, Nick, that show that, on the one hand, of course, we want to protect people against that reasonable fear because that undermines their freedom of speech and their freedom of action. On the other hand, especially when the person who is allegedly being threatened through very severe criticism is a government official, that runs against the most important kind of free speech in our democratic republic, which is kind of interesting. And that's the right to criticize, even vociferously and using rhetorical hyperbole, government officials, people who are carrying out public functions. So we've got concerns about democracy and free speech on both sides of the ledger here, right?
Yeah.
You can't have a democratic electoral process if election workers are being intimidated.
Right.
On the other hand, it's counter-democratic not to be able to criticize people who are carrying out government functions.
Exactly, Nadine. And it makes me think of a place like Russia, right, which is probably, infringes on speech too much. And people are concerned about something like that happening here. So I know I've only got like a minute left for you, but I know we'll have to have you back to explore this more. Trust me. But how do we balance concerns about not backsliding into a situation like a Russia where the press is improperly restricted? Do we have guardrails here in America? How would you balance that?
I would say, and more importantly, the Supreme Court has always put a thumb on the scales in favor of more vigorous free speech, even if it could be considered threatening in everyday language. So in 1969, the court overturned a conviction of somebody who had been convicted of threatening the then president of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He was a black man who was protesting against police abuse of unarmed black men. So things never change. And he was afraid of being drafted for Vietnam. And he said, if they ever give me a gun, the first man I'm going to get in my sights is LBJ. He was referring to the President of the United States. The Supreme Court overturned that conviction, and it said strong and extemporaneous rhetoric cannot be nicely channeled into purely dulcet phrases. So it said it was rhetorical hyperbole. It may sound threatening in everyday speech, but we got to err in favor of even that kind of language about public officials.
That's going to do it for this conversation. But Nadine, if you allow me, we're going to have you back. More ground to cover here. Author and law professor, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
We'll look forward to coming back. Thank you so much, Nick.
And this is the Metro. However, Ryan Patrick Cooper in the groove. What's happening? I know you censor yourself a little bit.
No censorship today. We're going to celebrate the birth of two legends, Marvin Gaye and Gil Scott-Heron, throughout the show today. Plus, lots of new music sprinkled in the groove coming up at noon.
Looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to that. That's the Metro for April 2nd, 2024. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform.
The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt. Our technical director is Nate Bender.
The Metro is a WDET production, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at wdet.org/donate.
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Thanks for listening, and we will see you tomorrow.
Yes, tomorrow for a hump day.
But you know what you will not see?
What?
The revolution, because it will not be televised. So says Gil Scott Heron.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.